Plan Vert, a systematic sabotage campaign to destroy the French railroad system, 162. Plan Rouge, to attack and destroy all German ammunition dumps across France, 162. Plan Blue, to attack and destroy all power lines across France, 162. Plan Violet, to attack and destroy phone lines in France, 162. Plan Jaune, to attack German command posts, 162. Plan Noir, to attack German fuel depots, 162. Plan Tortue, to sabotage the roads of France, 162. General de Gaulle himself was only informed by Churchill on June 4, 1944, that the Allies planned to land in France on 6 June. Until then, the Free French leaders had no idea when and where Operation Overlord was due to take place. 137. On 5 June 1944, orders were given to activate Plan Violet. 162 of all the plans, Plan Violet was most important to Operation Overlord. Since destroying telephone lines and cutting underground cables prevented phone calls and orders transmitted by telex from getting through and forced the Germans to use their radios to communicate. 163. As the code breakers of Bletchley Park had broken many of the codes encrypted by the Enigma machine, this gave a considerable intelligence advantage to the Allied generals. 163. During the Normandy campaign, the resistance was so effective in blowing up telephone lines and cables that the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS largely abandoned the French phone system as too unreliable and used the radio instead, thereby allowing Bletchley Park to listen. On 9 June 1944, Eisenhower reached an agreement recognizing the FFI was part of the Allied order of battle and that Koenig was to operate under his command. 137. On 10 June 1944, Koenig ordered the resistance not to engage in insurrection nationale like those attempted on the Glières Plateau or at Montmauchet, instead ordering, keep guerrilla activity below its maximum level. Do not mass together. Form small separate groups. 157. A statement issued by de Gaulle declared the FFI was part of the French army and resistance leaders were now all army officers, with those resistants commanding 30 men becoming sous-lieutenants, those commanding 100 becoming lieutenants, those commanding 300 becoming capitaines, those commanding 1,000 men becoming commandants, and those commanding 2,000 men becoming lieutenant colonels. 161. In a press communiqué issued on June 12, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt declared that he did not recognize the FFI as part of the French army and ordered the Wehrmacht to summary execute any Frenchman or Frenchwoman serving in the FFI. 148. The other major resistance operations were Plan Vert and Plan Tortue. 164. In June 1944, the resistance destroyed French railroads at 486 points, and by 7 June 1944, the day after D-Day, the Wehrmacht complained that due to sabotage that the main railroad lines between Avranches and Saint-Lô, between Cherbourg and Saint-Lô, and between Caen and Saint-Lô were now out of action. 164. As the Wehrmacht was forced to use the roads instead of railroads, Plan Tortue focused on ambushing the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS as they traveled to the battlefields of Normandy. 164. The Maquis were joined in their guerrilla campaign by the Jedburgh teams, SOE agents, the operational groups of the OSS, and by teams from the elite British Special Air Service SAS Regiment. 164. The SAS commandos had jeeps armored with machine guns that they used to travel across French countryside and ambush German convoys. 164. One SAS group, operating in Brittany, had an artillery gun flown in, which they used to destroy German tanks. Much to the surprise of the Germans, who were not expecting this much firepower to be used in ambushes. 164. A SAS officer, Ian Wellstead, described the Maquis band which he operated with. It was hard to tell what they had been before German labor laws threw them all together in the depths of the wild woods. Some had been shopkeepers, artisans, young sons of wealthy parents. Others were scum of the gutter and many were soldiers. Now, however, all were much the same. All wore the clothes and many still the wooden clogs of peasants. Some lucky ones had scraps of uniforms and British battle dress, but predominantly their clothes consisted of drab-colored shirts, blue overall trousers and German field boots, whose owners no doubt had ceased to require them for obvious reasons. They wore neither brassards nor regular uniform of any kind. The only distinguishable difference between the men of the Maquis and the men of the country from they had sprung was the pistol cocked aggressively from the trouser tops, the rifle on the shoulder, the sten on the back, or the string of grenades depending on the belt. 130. Sometimes, the Maquis wore armbands featuring the tricolor with either a cross of Lorraine or the initials FFI stamped on them, so they could maintain that they had insignia, and thus a sort of uniform, making them entitled to legal protection under the Geneva and Hague Conventions. 165. Usually, the Maquis and their Anglo-American allies would cut down a tree to block a road in the wooded section of the French countryside. Sometimes an anti-tank mine would be planted under the tree trunk, and the Germans would be ambushed with machine gun and sniper fire when they attempted to remove the tree blocking the road. 166. Such operations seriously delayed the Germans, with the elite 2nd Waffen SS Division Das Reich taking 18 days to travel from Toulouse to Caen. A journey that was expected to take only 3 days. 166. The Jade, Tommy Macpherson, who was attached to a Maquis band of 27 French and Spanish communists, taught the Maquisards to fire their Sten guns with wet clothes wrapped around the barrels, which made the Sten guns sound like heavy machine guns to experienced troops. As such, when the Maquis ambushed the men of the Das Reich Division, the SS took cover and responded far more cautiously than they would have if they had known that they were only under fire from Sten guns. 141. In a typical ambush of the Das Reich Division, Macpherson had a bomb planted on a bridge to knock out a half-truck while having the Maquis fire on the SS. When a Panther tank came up to engage the Maquis, one of the Maquisards threw a gammon grenade, which knocked out the tank tracks. 141. As more of the SS tanks began to shell the Maquis, Macpherson ordered his men to retreat, content to know he had delayed the Das Reich Division by several hours and that he would do the same again the next day and the next. 141. On 9 June 1944. The Das Reich Division took revenge for Maquis attacks by hanging 99 people selected at random in the town of Toul from all the lampposts in the town. 167. The next day, the Der Führer Regiment of the Das Reich Division destroyed the town of Oretter-sur-Glane, killing 642 people including 246 women and 207 children. 167. SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Dieckmann, the commanding officer of the Der Führer Regiment of the Das Reich Division, had wanted to destroy another French town, Oretter-sur-Vayres, whose people were said to be providing food and shelter to the Maquis, but had taken a wrong turn on the road, which led him and his men to Oretter-sur-Glane, whose people had never supported the Maquis. 155. One Wehrmacht division transferred from the Eastern Front to the Western Front took a week to move from the Soviet Union to the borders of France, and another 3 weeks to move from the French border to the Battle of Caen, as resistance attacks slowed down its movement. 141. An estimate by SHAEF stated the Germans were moving at only 25% of their normal daily speed due to the constant attacks of the Maquis all across France. 141. Though the Maquis caused the Germans much difficulty, the guerrillas tended not to fare well in sustained combat. 156. The SOE agent André Hue, who was leading a Maquis band in Brittany later, recalled the Battle of Saint Marcel as the firefight on 18 June 1944 at a farmhouse outside Saint Marcel he was using as his base. Now every weapon that the enemy possessed was brought to bear on our front line in a cacophony of shots and explosions which could not drown an even more sinister noise, the occasional crack of a single bullet. A man within feet of me slumped to the ground with blood spurting 2 feet into the air from the side of his neck. We had anticipated an infantry assault, possibly backed up with light armor, but snipers, a threat we had not met before, were difficult to counter. Within minutes of the first casualty, another 7 of our men lay dying within the farm complex. All had been shot from long range, 156. As the snipers continued to cut down his men, while he could hear the sound of panzers coming up in the distance, Hugh ordered his men to retreat into the woods under the cover of darkness, while using his radio to call in a RAF airstrike that disorganized the Germans enough to make escape possible. 156-168. Summarizing up the Battle of Saint Marcel, Hugh wrote, "The majority of the younger men had never been in battle, and seeing their friends' brains and guts oozing onto the grass and mud made them sick in the head and stomach. Just as terrifying to the young Frenchmen was the sight of those who were wounded and who yet had to die without help. I was not surprised that so many had enough. I was perhaps astonished that the number of defectors were so low, 156. All over France, the Maquis attempted to seize towns in June 1944, expecting the Allies to be there soon, often with tragic results. 140. For instance, in Saint-Amand-Montrond, the Maquis seized the town and took 13 militians and their associated women prisoners, including the wife of Francis Bout de Elan, a senior leader of the milice who intervened to take personal charge of the situation to get his wife back. 140. A joint German milice force marched on Saint-Amand-Montrond, causing the Maquis to retreat, and when the Axis forces arrived, 11 people were shot on the spot while a number of hostages were taken. 140. The milice chief of Orléans and the Archbishop of Bourges were able to negotiate an exchange on 23 June 1944. Where the Maquis released their female hostages, except for one woman who chose to join the Maquis in exchange for the milice releasing their hostages, though the Germans refused to free any of their hostages and instead deported them to the concentration camps. 140. As for the militians taken hostage, the Maquisards knew if they were freed, they would reveal their hideout and their names, as both the militians and Maquisards had grown up in the same town and knew each other well. Men on both sides had once been friends, while at the same time food was in short supply, making their hostages a drain on their food supplies, leading to the Maquisards to hang their hostages. Shooting them would make too much noise out in the woods. 169. Bout de Elan decided to seek revenge for his wife's captivity by sending a force of militians under Lécussin to round up the surviving Jews of Bourges and buried 36 Jews alive out in the woods, as Bout de Elan believed that the resistance was all the work of the Jews. 152. On 23 June 1944, Koenig began to operate, giving orders to all the SOE and OSS agents via the Special Forces headquarters. 148. By this time, the Maquis had formed assassination squads to kill collaborators, and on 28 June 1944, a group of Maquisards disguised as militians were able to enter the apartment of the radio newscaster Philippe Henriot, who was serving as Minister of Information and Propaganda in the Vichy government, and shot him down in front of his wife. 170. Darnard had the milice go on a rampage after Henriot's assassination, massacring resistants in Toulouse, Clermont-Ferrand, Grenoble, Lyon, and other places. For example, 7 resistants were publicity shot by the milice in the town square of Macon. 171. All over France, the Germans lashed out against the resistance in a spree of killings, of which the massacre at Oretter-sur-Glane is merely the most infamous. 172. Speaking of an atrocity committed outside of Nice in July 1944, one man testified at Nuremberg. Having been attacked by several groups of Maquis in the region by way of reprisals, a Mongolian detachment still under the SS went to a farm where two French members of the resistance had been hidden. Being unable to take them prisoner, these soldiers then took the proprietors of that farm, the husband and wife, and after subjecting them to numerous atrocities, knifing, rape, etc., they shot them down with submachine guns. Then they took the son of these victims, who was only 3 years of age, and after having frightfully tortured him, they crucified him on the gate of the farmhouse. 172. The reference to the Mongolians were to Asians serving in the Red Army who'd been captured by the Wehrmacht and joined either the German army's Asylgenen or the SS. The French called all these men Mongols, regardless if they were Mongols or not. The milice was especially hated by the resistance, and captured militians could expect little mercy. One Maquisard fighting in the Haute-Save wrote in his diary about the fate of a militian taken prisoner in July 1944. Age 29, married 3 months ago, made to saw wood in the hot sun wearing a pullover and jacket, made to drink warm salted water, ears cut off, covered with blows from fists and bayonets, stoned, made to dig his grave, made to lie in it, finished off with a blow in the stomach from a spade, 2 days to die, 173. The rejection of the Force C plan had not reached many of the Maquis leaders operating out in the countryside, and after the news of D-Day, the Maquis attempted to seize redoubts, most notably at the Verkers Plateau. 156. Eugene Chavin, the FFI chief in the Isère region, ordered all Maquis bands to concentrate on the Verkers Plateau after hearing of D-Day. 158. By 9 June 1944, some 3,000 Maquisards had heeded the call, and 3 July 1944, the Free Republic of the Verkers was proclaimed. 157. Though the Allies did try to fly in supplies to the redoubts, and the Maquis fought bravely, all these operations ended with the resistance defeated. 156. In the middle of June, the Wehrmacht had taken the village of Saint-Nazaire-du-Montserrat from the Maquis du Verkers, which severed the link between the Verkers Plateau and Grenoble. 174. To celebrate Bastille Day, the U.S. Army Air Force sent in 360 B-17s to drop supplies of weapons to the Maquisards on the Verkers Plateau. 157. However, the weapons the American dropped were all light weapons, and Chavin sent a radio message to Algiers on the night of 21 July 1944, asking for heavy weapons to be airdropped, called the leaders in Algiers criminals and cowards for not arranging more support, and ended with the line, "That's what we are saying, criminals and cowards." 174. In the Battle of the Verkers Plateau, the SS landed a glider company, and the Maquis suffered very heavy losses. 156. Many of the German units fighting on the Verkers were Asylgenen Eastern Legions, Red Army POWs, mostly Russians and Ukrainians, who had joined the SS after being taken prisoner in 1942 or 1943. By this point, the Germans had taken such heavy losses on the Eastern Front that they needed the manpower of the Asylgenen to compensate. While the same Alpine division that had taken the Glières Plateau in March stormed up the Verkers Plateau supported by a tank unit based in Lyon, the SS landed via glider. 174. The Maquis lost about 650, killed during the fighting on the Verkers Plateau, and afterwards, the Germans shot about 200 Maquisards, mostly wounded, who had been unable to escape, together with the medical team that had stayed behind to take care of them. 174. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Verkers, the local people were victims of massive reprisals which included numerous cases of looting, rape, and extrajudicial executions. 167. In early August 1944, Hitler ordered Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge to launch Operation Liberate against the Americans. As the resistance had severed the telephone lines, The orders for lootage were transmitted via the radio in a code that had been broken by the government code and cipher school, leading to ultra-intelligence that gave the Americans advanced notice and time to prepare for the coming offensive. 164. After the breakout from Normandy, Eisenhower had planned to bypass Paris, while Hitler had ordered General Dietrich von Choltitz to destroy Paris rather than allow the city be liberated. Stating Paris must be destroyed from top to bottom before the Wehrmacht leaves. Do not leave a church or cultural monument standing. 175. The FFI in Paris, led by Alexander Parodi and Jacques Chaban-Delmas, urged patience, while Henry Tanguy, codenamed Colonel Rahl, the FTP chief in Paris, wanted to start a revolt, being deterred only by the fact that the resistance in Paris had about 15,000 men, but only 600 guns, mostly rifles and machine guns. 176. On 19 August 1944, the Paris police, until then still loyal to Vichy, went over to the resistance as a group of policemen hosted the tricolor over the Préfecture de Police on the Isle de la Cité, which was the first time the tricolor had flown in Paris since June 1940. 176. All over Paris, the outlawed tricolor started to fly over schools, mairies, and police stations. An open challenge to German power, and a sign that the French civil service was shifting its loyalty. 176. Emboldened, Tanguy and his men started to attack German forces on the Boulevard Saint-Michel and Boulevard Saint-Germain, leading to a mass insurrection as Parisians started to build barricades in the streets. 176. By the end of the day, about 50 Germans and 150 resistants had been killed, and not wanting the communists to have the credit for liberating Paris, the Gaullist Parodi sanctioned the uprising. 176. Faced with an urban uprising that he was unprepared for, Choltitz arranged a truce with Parodi via the Swedish consul Raoul Nordling, marking the first time that the Germans had treated the resistance as a legitimate opponent. 177. On 21 August 1944, Koenig was given command of all the BCRA agents, the SOE's F-section and RF-section agents, and the Jedburgh teams, which reflected the political need to put all of the resistance under French control. 148. By the end of August 1944, the SOE had a total of 53 radio stations operating in France, up from the 2 it had begun with in May 1941. 73. De Gaulle disapproved of the truce as he used the uprising to order on 22 August General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division to liberate Paris, stating he did not want the communists to liberate the city. 178. On 24 August, French soldiers entered Paris, which led to some hours of intense fighting before Choltitz surrendered on 25 August. Though pockets of German and milice forces fought on for several more days, as Choltitz simply did not inform his forces of his plans to surrender. 178. On the afternoon of August 25, 1944, de Gaulle returned to Paris, a city he not set foot in since June 1940, to be greeted by vast cheering crowds as he walked down the Champs-Élysées. 179. As various cities, towns, and villages were liberated in France, the resistance was usually the most organized force that took over. 180 many resistants were disgusted by the mass influx of new members in the dying days of the struggle, contemptuously calling them the FFS, Forces Françaises de Septembre, French Forces of September, or the Septemberists for short. As all these people had conveniently only discovered their French patriotism in September 1944. 180. In the middle of 1944, Chaban-Delmas had reported to de Gaulle that the FFI numbered 15,000 in Paris, but the time of the liberation of Paris on 25 August 1944. Between 50,000 and 60,000 people were wearing FFI armbands. 181. The liberation of France began with D-Day on 6 June 1944, but different areas of France were liberated at different times. 182. Strasbourg was not liberated until November 1944, and some coastal towns on the English Channel and the Atlantic like Dunkirk were still in German hands when the war ended on 8 May 1945. Ausby observed, "There was no national day for liberation. Each town and village still celebrates a different day, the gaps between them marking advances that often looked bogged down, pockets of German defense that often turned out to be unexpectedly tough. It proved the bitterest of ends to a bitter war." 182. As France was liberated, many resistants enlisted in the French army, with 75,000 resistants fighting as regular soldiers by November 1944. And by the end of the war, 135,000 resistants were serving with the French forces advancing into Germany. 183. For many resistance leaders who gave themselves the title of captain or colonel, it was quite a come-down to be reduced to a private. 183. Besides attempting to establish a government, the resistance took its revenge on collaborators who were often beaten or killed in extrajudicial executions. 180 militians were usually shot without the bother of a trial, and at least 10,000 militians were shot in 1944. 184. The young women who had engaged in collaboration horizontal by sleeping with the Germans were singled out and had their heads publicly shaven as a mark of their disgrace, which meant that a good percentage of the young women in France were shaven bald in 1944. 180. The attacks on the young women who had German lovers had the atmosphere of a savage carnival, as the women were rounded by mobs to be insulted, beaten, and shaven. 185. One resistant in the Gard region explained the violence to a reporter in September 1944. "I'll simply say that the majority of the FFI have been outlaws. They are lads from the mining areas. They have been hunted. They have been imprisoned. They have been tortured by militians whom they now recognize. It is understandable that they should now want to beat them up." 185. At the time, many feared that France was on the verge of civil war, as it was felt that the FTP might attempt to seize power, but owing to the shortage of arms and loyalty to Moscow, which recognized General de Gaulle as France's leader, the Communists chose to pursue power via ballots rather than bullets. 180. In the aftermath of the liberation, the SOE agents were all ordered out of France, as the Anglophobic de Gaulle wished to maintain a version of history where the SOE never existed, and the resistance was entirely a French affair. 180. De Gaulle also promoted a version of history where France, for the entire occupation from 1940 to 1944, had been a nation in arms, with the resistance representing almost the entirety of the French people, had been waging a guerrilla struggle from the beginning of the occupation right to its end. His concern was then to rebuild France not only on the material and international level, but also morally, pushing him to put forward the actions of the resistance to re-establish national unity and pride, which the war had damaged. On 17 September 1944, in Bordeaux, the SOE agent Roger Lannes, who became the leader of the resistance in Bordeaux after André Grand-Clément, the previous leader had been exposed as a Gestapo informer, was taking part in the celebrations of the liberation of Bordeaux when General de Gaulle motioned to him to come aside for a chat. 180. De Gaulle told Lannes, who was wearing the uniform of a British Army officer, that he was not welcome in France and had 2 hours to leave the city and 2 days to leave France. 180. The Francophile Lannes, who had been born in Britain but grew up in France, was profoundly hurt by this request and sadly left the nation he loved so much. 180. De Gaulle had wanted a resistance to give proof of France éternelle that held out against the occupation. However, he was angered by the fact that the resistants often seemed to consider themselves as the new, legitimate authorities of the towns and cities they had liberated. Therefore, in the wake of the liberation of the national territory, he openly considered them as troublemakers hindering the return to normalcy and rule of law which he pursued. 186. Everywhere, The resistants were pushed out of power to be replaced by the same civil servants who had served first the Third Republic, to be followed by Vichy, or the Naftalinés, army officers who had gone into retirement in 1940 and resumed their service with the Liberation. 181. Factions. Resistant prisoners in France, July 1944. Resistant prisoners in France, 1940. The French resistance involved men and women representing a broad range of ages, social classes, occupations, religions, and political affiliations. In 1942, one resistance leader claimed that the movement received support from four groups: the lower middle and middle classes, university professors and students, the entire working class, and a large majority of the peasants. 187. Resistance leader Emmanuel Destir de la Vigerie observed that the resistance had been composed of social outcasts or those on the fringes of society, saying, "One could be a resistor only if one was maladjusted." 188. Although many, including Destir himself, did fit this description, most members of the resistance came from traditional backgrounds. 189, and were individuals of exceptional strong-mindedness, ready to break with family and friends, attribution needed. 190, to serve a higher purpose. The question of how many were active in the resistance has been raised. While stressing that the issue was sensitive and approximate, 191, François Marcotte, a professor of history at the Sorbonne, ventured an estimate of 200,000 activists and a further 300,000 with substantial involvement in resistance operations. 191. Historian Robert Paxton estimated the number of active resistors at about 2% of the adult French population, or about 400,000, and went on to observe that there were, no doubt, wider complicities, but even if one adds those willing to read underground newspapers, only some 2 million persons, or around 10% of the adult population, 192, had been willing to risk any involvement at all. The post-war government of France officially recognized 220,000 men and women. 193. Gaullist resistance. Further information: Free France and Gaullism. The French flag with the Cross of Lorraine, emblem of the Free French. The doctrine of Gaullism was born during the Second World War as a French movement of patriotic resistance to the German invasion of 1940. Men of all political stripes who wanted to continue the fight against Adolf Hitler and who rejected the armistice concluded by Maréchal Philippe Pétain rallied to General Charles de Gaulle's position. As a consequence, on 2 August 1940, de Gaulle was condemned to death in absentia by the Vichy regime. Between July and October 1940, de Gaulle rejected the unconstitutional, repressive, and racist laws instituted by Pétain, and established his own bona fides, good faith, as the principal defender of Republican values. He asked, in his appeal